Sometimes the things people leave behind aren't worthless. They're just waiting for the right person to understand them. The rain had already started by the time Ethan Walker stepped out of the courthouse, a slow, steady drizzle that soaked into his flannel jacket like it had nowhere else to go, much like the weight pressing into his chest. He stood there for a moment, staring at the folded papers in his hand, the final proof that a life he once believed in had quietly unraveled, line by line, signature by signature, until all that remained was a name, a date, and a division of things that no longer felt like they belonged to him. His ex-wife had driven off 10 minutes earlier in the SUV they once shared, headed toward a house that used to echo with laughter and now would echo without him, leaving Ethan with the one thing nobody else wanted, a dilapidated shack listed at the bottom of the settlement, barely mentioned, tucked between legal language like an afterthought. Beside him, Ranger sat patiently, his thick coat damp from the rain. Ember eyes fixed not on the courthouse or the road ahead, but on Ethan himself, as if measuring something deeper than loss, something quieter than defeat. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the familiar stiffness that came from years of carrying weight most people never saw, years spent building bridges under pressure, clearing paths no one else could cross, and somehow still ending up here, holding a piece of paper that said everything he had built at home was no longer his. "Guess it's just you and me now, huh?" he muttered, his voice low, more to fill the silence than to expect an answer, and Ranger tilted his head slightly, ears twitching as if the words carried more meaning than they sounded. The drive out to Pine Hollow took just under an hour, though it felt longer, the kind of road that narrowed the farther you went, lined with aging pines and patches of land that looked forgotten by time. The kind of place where people didn't come unless they had nowhere else to be. Ethan's old pickup rattled along the dirt path, tires crunching over gravel, until finally the shack came into view, sitting crooked at the edge of a clearing like it had been leaning into the wind for years and never quite found its balance again. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the quiet settle around him, broken only by the soft ticking of the cooling engine and the distant rustle of leaves shifting under the weight of the rain. "Well," he said under his breath, a faint trace of dry humor slipping through, "they really outdid themselves with this one." And he stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the damp ground as he took in the place that was now, somehow, his. The shack's wooden boards were weathered to a dull gray, edges splintered, paint long since peeled away, the roof sagging just enough to suggest it had given up trying to hold itself straight, and the front door hung uneven on its hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze as if breathing in slow, tired rhythms. To anyone else, it was nothing more than a structure waiting to collapse, a piece of land that cost more to fix than it could ever be worth. But to Ethan, it was something else entirely. Not hope, not yet, but at least a place where no one could take anything else from him. Ranger jumped down from the truck with practiced ease, landing softly despite his size, and for a brief moment he behaved like any dog might, sniffing the air, taking in the unfamiliar sense of damp wood, old earth, and something faintly metallic that lingered beneath it all. Then, just as Ethan started toward the door, Ranger stopped. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just a subtle shift in posture, a stillness that replaced movement, his ears lifting higher, his body aligning with a focus that didn't belong to curiosity but to recognition. Ethan noticed it immediately, the way a man notices a change in wind before a storm, and he paused, watching the dog carefully. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more attentive, but Ranger didn't look at him. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward the shack, eyes narrowing slightly as if listening to something that hadn't yet reached human ears. The rain tapped softly against the roof, the trees whispered in the distance, and for a moment everything seemed ordinary, almost forgettable, until Ranger let out a low, restrained sound, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, something deeper, something older, the kind of sound he used back when every signal mattered. Ethan felt a familiar tension rise in his chest, not fear, but awareness, the kind that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant loss. And he stepped closer to the shack, each footfall measured, each breath steady, the past and present folding together in a way he hadn't expected. He reached out and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest, revealing a dim interior where shadows stretched across uneven floorboards and the faint smell of dust and time lingered in the air. Ranger moved past him, slow and deliberate, paused, barely making a sound as he crossed the threshold, and then, halfway into the room, he stopped again. This time, there was no mistaking it. His body stiffened, his gaze locked onto a single spot near the old wood stove, and after a brief, almost sacred pause, he lifted one paw and placed it firmly on the floor. Then he barked, once, twice, 3 times, sharp, precise, and unmistakable. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to, because in that moment, standing inside a place the world had already dismissed, he understood something quietly, something that didn't need proof yet felt undeniable. Maybe this shack wasn't the end of what he had lost. Maybe, just maybe it was the beginning of something that had been waiting long before he ever arrived. The sound of Ranger's bark did not echo like an ordinary noise in an empty room. It settled into the wood itself as if the house had been waiting to hear it again after many years of silence, and Ethan stood still just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior while something older than logic told him not to dismiss what he had just witnessed. The air inside the shack carried a dry, dusty weight, mixed with the faint scent of rust and aged timber, the kind that clung to places that had not been disturbed in decades, and as the wind pressed softly against the outer walls, the structure responded with a low creak that almost sounded like a slow exhale. Ethan stepped forward carefully, boots pressing into uneven floorboards that groaned under his weight, each step deliberate, measured, the way he had once moved through unfamiliar terrain where every detail mattered, and Ranger did not follow immediately, instead remaining fixed at that same spot near the old wood stove, his body angled slightly forward, ears high, eyes locked on the floor as if there was something beneath it that only he could hear. "You are not chasing mice, are you?" Ethan murmured, though his voice carried no humor this time, only quiet curiosity, and when Ranger did not react to the tone, Ethan knew this was different. He crouched slowly, lowering himself to the dog's level, and placed his hand flat against the floor where Ranger had set his paw moments earlier, expecting nothing more than cold wood and dust, but instead he felt it, faint and subtle, a slight difference in texture. A shift that was not immediately visible but unmistakable once noticed, as if one section of the floor had been disturbed long ago and then carefully set back into place. He ran his fingers along the seams between the boards, tracing the lines until one edge gave slightly under pressure, not enough to move, but enough to confirm that something beneath it did not belong to the rest of the structure. Ranger let out a soft huff, almost impatient, and tapped the same spot again with his paw, once, then twice, his nails clicking lightly against the wood in a rhythm that carried intention rather than instinct. Ethan leaned closer, studying the grain of the board, noticing how the nails along one side were slightly newer than the others, not by much, but enough to stand out to someone trained to see patterns where others saw nothing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folding knife, the same one he had carried for years, its handle worn smooth from use, and carefully slid the tip into the narrow gap between the boards, applying just enough pressure to test it without breaking the wood. For a moment, nothing happened, and the house remained still, holding its breath, until finally the board shifted. With a soft crack, the sound dry and restrained, like something being released rather than broken, Ethan paused, listening, waiting for any sign that he had disturbed more than just old timber, but the only response was the steady rhythm of rain against the roof and the quiet presence of Ranger beside him. Slowly, he pried the board upward, lifting it inch by inch until it came free, revealing a shallow space beneath that had been carefully concealed, and instead of dirt or debris, there sat a small metal box, rectangular, worn at the edges, its surface dulled by time but still intact, as if it had been placed there with intention and left undisturbed for years. Ethan stared at it for a moment, not reaching for it immediately, because something about its presence felt deliberate, not accidental, not forgotten, but waiting. Ranger lowered his head slightly, sniffing the air above the opening, his tail still, his posture calm now, as if the tension that had brought him here had softened into certainty. "All right," Ethan whispered, more to steady himself than to say anything meaningful, and he reached down, fingers brushing against the cool metal as he lifted the box from its hidden place. It was heavier than it looked, solid in a way that suggested it held more than just empty space, and when he set it gently on the floor beside him, a faint metallic sound came from within, subtle but unmistakable. The lid was secured with a simple latch. No lock, no barrier, as if whoever had placed it there had never intended to keep it hidden forever. Only until the right moment. Ethan hesitated, his thumb resting against the latch, a strange awareness settling over him, the kind that comes when a moment feels larger than it should, when something small carries the weight of something much greater. Outside, the rain softened, the steady rhythm fading into a quieter drizzle, and inside the shack, the air seemed to shift, as if the space itself was leaning closer. Waiting to see what he would do next, Ranger sat beside him now, calm, watchful, his eyes no longer searching but certain, and that was enough. Ethan flipped the latch open slowly, the metal giving way with a soft click that echoed more than it should have in the small room, and he lifted the lid, revealing the contents inside. At first, it did not look like much, just a few items resting in the dim light filtering through the cracked window. But as his eyes adjusted, the details began to form, and he felt something in his chest tighten, not from fear, but from recognition. As if the past had reached forward and placed itself directly into his hands without warning. Because whatever this shack had been before, whatever people believed it to be now, it was no longer just a place left behind, and Ethan understood that the moment he touched what was inside that box, his life was no longer moving in the same direction it had been just hours earlier. For a long moment Ethan did not move, his hand resting on the edge of the open box as if even the smallest motion might disturb something fragile that had survived far longer than it should have, and the dim light slipping through the cracked window settled across the contents in a way that felt almost intentional, as though the shack itself was choosing how much to reveal at once. Inside the metal box lay a carefully arranged set of items. None of them flashy, none of them immediately valuable, in the way people usually measured worth, but each carrying a quiet weight that made Ethan's breath slow without him realizing it. On top rested a photograph, edges worn and slightly curled, the kind of picture taken decades ago with a camera that captured more feeling than detail, and as he lifted it gently between his fingers, the image came into focus. A younger man standing beside a structure that looked unmistakably like this very shack, though in better days, the wood straighter, the roof intact, and beside him sat a German shepherd, alert and proud, its posture nearly identical to Ranger's. Ethan's eyes lingered on the man's face, searching for recognition he could not fully explain, because there was something familiar there, not in appearance exactly, but in the way he stood, shoulders squared not in pride but in endurance, the quiet stance of someone who had seen more than he ever spoke about. Beneath the photograph lay a small brass key, heavier than it appeared, its surface smooth from use rather than time, and next to it, folded with precise care, was a single piece of paper, aged but intact, the ink still dark enough to read. Ethan hesitated again before opening it, not out of fear, but out of a growing sense that whatever was written there had been waiting for a very long time to be seen, and once it was read, things would not remain the same. Ranger shifted slightly beside him, no longer tense, but watchful, his gaze moving between Ethan and the contents of the box as if he already understood something that had yet to be spoken aloud. Slowly, Ethan unfolded the paper, the soft crackle of aged fibers filling the quiet room, and his eyes moved across the words written in steady, deliberate handwriting. If you are reading this, then the dog has done what he was trained to do, and you are standing exactly where you are meant to be. The line sat there with a calm certainty that sent a faint chill through Ethan's chest, not because it was frightening, but because it felt personal in a way that defied coincidence. He read on, each word drawing him deeper into something he had not expected to find at the end of a dirt road and a broken marriage. The note spoke of a man who had built this place not as a home, but as a marker, a quiet signal hidden in plain sight. A place meant to be overlooked by everyone except the one person who would not ignore what others dismissed. It mentioned service, not in detail, but in tone, the kind of language only someone who had lived through it would understand, and it spoke of a responsibility, not to wealth or land, but to something carried forward, something preserved until the right moment. Ethan lowered the paper slightly, his eyes drifting back to the photograph, and for a brief second he felt the strange sensation of time folding in on itself, as if the man in that image had known somehow that one day someone like him would stand here, holding these same objects, asking the same unspoken questions. "You see this too, do you not?" he said quietly, glancing at Ranger, and the dog blinked once, slow and steady, before shifting his attention toward the far side of the room, his ears lifting again, not sharply this time, but with a renewed focus that suggested there was more to this than what lay in Ethan's hands. Ethan followed the direction of the dog's gaze, his eyes scanning the dim interior until they settled on the back wall of the shack, where the wood looked slightly different, not broken, not obviously altered, but just enough to stand apart from the rest if one knew what to look for. He set the photograph, the key, and the note carefully back into the box, though he did not close it this time, leaving it open as if acknowledging that whatever had been hidden was no longer meant to stay that way. Rising slowly, he crossed the room, each step measured, the old boards shifting beneath his weight with soft, tired sounds, until he stood in front of the section of wall that had caught Ranger's attention. Up close, the difference was clearer. The grain of the wood interrupted in a way that suggested it had been placed there, rather than grown into position, and when Ethan pressed his hand against it, he felt it give slightly, not enough to move, but enough to confirm what his instincts were already telling him. Behind this wall, there was more. He glanced back once at the open box on the floor, at the photograph of the man and the dog who had come before him, and then at Ranger, who now stood beside him again, calm but certain, his presence steady in a way that felt less like companionship and more like guidance. Ethan exhaled slowly, a quiet acceptance settling into his posture, because somewhere between the courthouse and this moment, something had shifted inside him, something that no longer saw this shack as a burden or a mistake, but as a doorway he had not chosen, yet somehow needed, and as his fingers traced the edge of the hidden panel, he understood one simple truth with a clarity that did not need explanation. Some places are not given to you because they are worth something, they are given to you because you are meant to uncover what they were hiding. The wood did not resist the way Ethan expected it to, it gave slowly, almost willingly, as if the years had not sealed it shut but simply waited for the right hands to return, and as his fingers pressed along the edge, he found a narrow groove hidden in the grain, subtle enough to disappear under casual inspection but deliberate enough to guide someone who knew how to look. Ranger stood close at his side, not restless, not tense, but grounded, his presence steady like an anchor in a place where time felt uneven, and when Ethan applied a little more pressure, the panel shifted inward with a low, hollow sound that echoed deeper than the thin wall should have allowed. He paused, listening, his instincts sharpening as the quiet stretched out around him, but there was no sudden movement, no warning, only the faint hum of space beyond, a stillness that carried weight rather than emptiness. Slowly, he pulled the panel back, revealing a narrow opening just wide enough for a man to pass through, and behind it, darkness, not the simple absence of light, but a deeper kind. The kind that suggested distance rather than confinement. The air that drifted out was cool and dry, carrying a faint metallic scent layered beneath something older, like sealed earth and forgotten rooms, and Ethan felt it settle into his lungs as he took a careful breath, steadying himself before stepping forward. "Stay close," he said quietly, though he did not need to, because Ranger was already moving with him, his body aligned, his steps silent, as they crossed the threshold together. Inside, the space opened just enough to reveal the beginning of a passage, its walls reinforced with aged wooden beams that had darkened over time but remained solid, arranged with the precision of someone who understood structure, someone who had built not for appearance but for endurance. Ethan reached back briefly, pulling the small flashlight from his pack, and when he switched it on, the beam cut through the darkness in a narrow line, revealing more of the passage ahead, sloping gently downward at an angle that suggested this was not an afterthought but a planned extension of the shack above. The ground beneath his boots shifted from rough boards to compact earth, firm and carefully packed, and each step forward carried him deeper into something that felt Less like a discovery and more like a return to a place he had never been before. Ranger moved slightly ahead now, his nose low, ears alert but not alarmed, his behavior no longer searching but guiding, and Ethan followed without hesitation, trusting the quiet signals that had carried them this far. After several yards, the passage widened, opening into a chamber that made Ethan stop in place, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that what lay before him did not belong to the image of a broken shack left to decay. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the space, revealing walls lined with reinforced panels, a workbench built with care, shelves holding neatly arranged objects that had been preserved rather than abandoned, and in the center of the room, a metal table, its surface clean, untouched by dust in a way that felt almost impossible after so many years. The silence here was different, heavier, as if the room held on to sound rather than letting it pass, and Ethan felt it settle around him as he took a few steps forward, his boots leaving faint impressions in a thin layer of dust that had not been disturbed in a very long time. Ranger circled once, slow and deliberate, before stopping near the far side of the chamber, his head tilting slightly as he focused on something beyond Ethan's immediate view, and when Ethan followed that line of sight, the beam of his flashlight revealed a large steel cabinet set into the wall, its surface marked by time but still intact, its edges sealed with a precision that suggested it had been closed with intention, not neglect. Ethan approached it slowly, each step carrying a quiet weight, because by now he understood that nothing in this place was accidental. Every detail had been placed, preserved, and protected for a reason that was only beginning to take shape. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool metal, and felt the faint outline of a keyhole set into the center, worn just enough to show it had once been used regularly, and as he stood there, the memory of the brass key resting in the box above surfaced in his mind with a clarity that felt almost like a response rather than a thought. He exhaled slowly, a quiet recognition settling into him, because the path from the courthouse to this moment no longer felt random, no longer felt like a series of losses leading nowhere, but something else entirely, something guided, something that had been waiting long before he ever stepped foot on that dirt road. Behind him, Ranger let out a soft, steady breath, his presence calm, unwavering. And Ethan realized that the dog was no longer searching for answers, he was standing beside them. The room did not feel abandoned, it felt paused, as if time itself had stepped aside and left everything exactly as it needed to be until this moment arrived. And as Ethan reached into his jacket, preparing to retrieve the key that might unlock whatever had been sealed away here, he understood something simple but undeniable, that the shack above was never the story, it was only the door. And everything that mattered had been waiting just beneath it, patient, silent, and ready to be found by someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to uncover. The brass key felt heavier now than it had in Ethan's hand just minutes earlier, as if the space around him had given it a new kind of weight, one that did not come from metal but from meaning, and as he held it between his fingers, the faint reflection of the flashlight gliding across its worn surface, he noticed details he had missed before, the subtle ridges along the shaft, the small engraving near the base that looked less like decoration and more like a mark of identification, something placed there not for beauty but for recognition. Ranger stood close, his body angled toward the steel cabinet, his breathing slow and steady, the earlier tension replaced by a quiet certainty that felt almost grounding, as if whatever had drawn him here had now settled into place. Ethan stepped forward, the compact earth beneath his boots firm and unmoving, and positioned himself in front of the cabinet, the cool metal surface reflecting a dull outline of his figure, a man who had walked into this place carrying loss and now stood on the edge of something he did not yet understand. For a brief moment, he hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the silence that had preserved this room for so long, because opening something like this was not just an action, it was a turning point. He exhaled slowly, steadying his hand, and guided the key toward the keyhole, the metal sliding in with a precision that left no room for coincidence, and when he turned it, the mechanism responded immediately with a low, deliberate click, the sound echoing softly through the chamber like a signal that something long closed had finally been acknowledged. The cabinet door did not swing open on its own, it resisted slightly at first, as if reminding him that whatever lay behind it had not been meant for careless hands, and Ethan placed his palm against the surface, applying gentle pressure until it gave way, the hinges releasing with a slow, controlled motion that revealed the interior inch by inch. The beam of the flashlight moved forward, cutting through the shadow. And what it revealed did not overwhelm him with chaos or clutter, but with order, with intention, with a quiet sense of purpose that was far more striking than anything loud or dramatic could have been. Inside the cabinet were shelves, each one carefully arranged, holding objects that had been preserved not for display but for use, for continuation, for something that had not yet finished. There were sealed envelopes, their edges crisp despite the years, each labeled with names written in the same steady handwriting Ethan had seen in the note, names that felt personal even before he knew why. Beside them were folders, thick with documents, their covers marked with dates that stretched back decades, some older than Ethan himself, and as he reached out to touch one, he felt the faint texture of aged paper beneath his fingertips, a reminder that whatever story this place held had been unfolding long before his own had taken shape. Ranger shifted slightly, moving closer to the cabinet, his nose lifting toward the lower shelf where something else rested. And when Ethan followed that motion, he saw it, a small wooden box, darker than the others, its surface polished smooth, its edges worn not by neglect but by handling, by time spent in hands that had cared enough to preserve it. Ethan crouched slowly, setting the flashlight on the edge of the cabinet so its beam angled downward, and reached for the box, lifting it with both hands, feeling its weight settle evenly, balanced, deliberate. Unlike the metal box above, this one carried a warmth to it, the wood holding on to the memory of touch, and when he placed it gently on the table behind him and opened it, the contents inside drew his breath in a way that surprised him. There were photographs, many of them, each capturing moments that felt both ordinary and significant, men standing beside structures, beside dogs, beside landscapes that looked like different parts of the same story, and as Ethan picked one up, he noticed the pattern. Every image held the same quiet presence, a man who looked like he had carried something heavy, and a dog who stood beside him not as a companion, but as a partner. Beneath the photographs lay a journal, its cover worn but intact, the pages inside filled with handwriting that carried the same steady rhythm as the note, and when Ethan opened it, the first line he saw settled into him with a quiet clarity that felt almost like a voice speaking across time. This place was never meant to be found by someone who had everything, it was meant for the one who had nothing left but still chose to stand. Ethan paused, his hand resting lightly on the page, the words echoing something inside him that he had not yet found language for, and for the first time since stepping into this hidden space, he understood that what he was uncovering was not just a secret, it was a continuation. He glanced back at Ranger, who now sat calmly at his side, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady, as if confirming what Ethan was only beginning to accept. This was not about luck, it was not about chance, and it was not about something being left behind by accident. It was about something being held in place until the right person arrived, someone who would not walk away from what others dismissed, someone who would listen when a dog barked 3 times in a quiet, forgotten room. And as Ethan turned another page in the journal, the weight of everything he had lost earlier that day began to shift, not disappearing, not fading, but settling into a new shape, one that no longer felt like an ending, but like the beginning of a path he had not known existed until the moment he chose to follow it. The pages of the journal did not rush Ethan, they did not demand to be read quickly or understood all at once, instead they unfolded slowly beneath his fingers, each line carrying the quiet weight of someone who had taken the time to think, to endure, and to leave behind something that could outlast his own voice. The handwriting remained steady throughout, not rushed, not fading, as if the man who wrote it had known exactly how much needed to be said and exactly how long it would take for someone to finally read it. Ethan leaned slightly against the edge of the table, the flashlight casting a soft glow across the open pages, and Ranger settled beside him, lowering himself onto the ground with a calm that felt earned rather than assumed. The room no longer felt unfamiliar, it felt present, as though it had shifted from a hidden place into a waiting one. Something that had quietly moved from past into present without needing permission. Ethan's eyes followed the lines of the journal, And as he read, the pieces began to take shape in a way that no single object could explain on its own. The man who had built this place had not done so for secrecy alone, he had done it for preservation, not of wealth in the usual sense, but of something more difficult to measure, something tied to responsibility and continuity. And the journal spoke of others who had come before, not many, but enough to form a pattern, each one arriving not because they were chosen by people, but because they had reached a point in their lives where there was nothing left to take from them, only something left to give. The words described men who had lost homes, families, or direction, men who had walked through parts of life that stripped away certainty and left only instinct, and each time, the pattern repeated, a dog, a signal, a place that appeared insignificant until it was not. Ethan paused, his hand resting lightly on the page as he let that settle in, because for the first time he was not just reading a story, he was recognizing himself inside it, not in the details, but in the shape of it, in the quiet collapse that had brought him here, and the unexpected stillness that had followed. He turned another page, slower now, more deliberate, and found a section that shifted from reflection into instruction, not commands, but guidance. Written in a tone that suggested trust rather than authority. It spoke of the room he stood in, of the cabinet, of the items within it, and of the purpose they were meant to serve, not for profit, not for personal gain, but for continuation, for carrying something forward that could not survive if left in the hands of those who measured value too quickly. Ethan glanced up from the journal, his eyes moving across the shelves again, seeing them differently now, not as stored objects, but as parts of something ongoing, something that had paused here, waiting for the next step. Ranger lifted his head slightly, his ears tilting toward the far corner of the room, not sharply, but with a quiet awareness that suggested there was still more to uncover, and Ethan followed that motion, noticing a section of the wall he had not paid much attention to before, partially shadowed, its surface marked by a faint outline that blended into the structure unless viewed from the right angle. He closed the journal carefully, not shutting it away, but marking a pause, and stepped toward that corner, each movement steady, grounded, as if the uncertainty that had followed him into this place was slowly being replaced by something more stable, something that did not need to rush. The floor beneath him remained firm, the air cool and unchanged, but the feeling in the room had shifted again, not in sound, but in presence, as if something else had been waiting just beyond what he had already seen. He reached out, his fingers brushing along the wall, tracing the faint outline until he found it, a small indentation. Almost invisible, but precise enough to confirm what his instincts were already telling him. This was not just a room, it was part of a larger design, one that revealed itself in layers, each one requiring attention rather than force. Behind him, Ranger stood quietly, watching, his posture relaxed but attentive, no longer searching, but present, as if the role he had played in bringing Ethan here was now giving way to something else, something shared. Ethan pressed gently against the indentation, and for a brief moment, nothing happened, the wall holding its place as it had for years, until slowly, with a subtle shift that felt more like release than resistance, a section of it moved, opening just enough to reveal a narrow space beyond, darker than the room itself, deeper, and carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sense of distance. Ethan stood there, looking into that opening, and felt a quiet realization settle into him. Not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, clear, and undeniable. Whatever this place had been before, whatever it had held through the years, it was not finished yet. And neither was he. The narrow opening in the wall did not invite haste, it seemed to ask for patience, the kind that listens before it moves, and Ethan stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness beyond, his breathing steady, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the hidden panel as if grounding himself in the present before stepping further into what felt like a continuation of something already in motion. Ranger moved first this time, not quickly, not with urgency, but with a calm certainty that carried no hesitation, his paws making almost no sound as he slipped through the opening, his body disappearing into the shadow before Ethan followed, the beam of the flashlight trailing behind him as it stretched into the space ahead. The passage beyond was narrower than the first, its walls reinforced not with wood but with aged concrete, smooth in some places, rough in others, marked by time but still solid. And the air here felt cooler, more still, carrying a faint dryness that suggested it had been sealed from the outside world for longer than anything above. Ethan stepped forward carefully, the light guiding his path as the ground beneath his boots shifted from compact earth to a firmer surface, something closer to poured concrete, and with each step, the sense of distance grew, not in yards alone, but in feeling, as if he were moving further away from the life he had known and deeper into something that had been waiting quietly beneath it. Ranger paused ahead, his ears lifting slightly, not in alarm, but in recognition, and when Ethan closed the distance between them, the passage opened once more, revealing a second chamber, smaller than the first but more focused. More intentional, like a room built for a single purpose. Rather than many, the flashlight moved slowly across it, revealing a long table set against the far wall, its surface clean, its edges sharp, and above it, mounted carefully, were maps, dozens of them, layered and overlapping, each marked with lines, symbols, and notes written in the same steady hand Ethan had seen in the journal. The sight made him stop, not out of confusion, but because something about it felt organized in a way that went beyond storage. This was not a collection, it was a system. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the maps, recognizing places he had heard of, regions marked by coordinates rather than names, routes drawn with precision that spoke of planning rather than guesswork, and beside each map, there were small tags, dates, initials, and symbols that seemed to correspond to something beyond what was immediately visible. Ranger moved to the center of the room, his posture relaxed now. His tail low but steady, as if the tension that had guided him here had fully dissolved into understanding, and he sat down, watching Ethan with a quiet attentiveness that felt less like expectation and more like confirmation. Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing lightly over one of the maps, tracing a line that led from a point he recognized to another he did not, and beneath it, a note written in the same careful script caught his attention. Every place has its keeper, but not every keeper is chosen the same way. The words settled into him with a clarity that did not need explanation, because by now he understood that this was not just about locations, it was about people, about those who had come before, each one connected not by circumstance, but by something quieter, something that had guided them here when everything else had fallen away. He stepped back slightly, taking in the room as a whole, the maps, the table, the arrangement of everything around him, and for the first time, the scale of it began to form in his mind. This was not a single hidden room beneath a forgotten shack, it was part of something larger, something that stretched beyond this place, beyond this moment. Something that had been built piece by piece over years, perhaps decades, by individuals who had never met yet had followed the same path. Ranger shifted again, his gaze moving toward the far wall where a small, sealed compartment was set into the concrete, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it, and when Ethan followed that line of sight, he felt a quiet recognition settle in, the same feeling that had guided him from the floorboard to the metal box, from the box to the cabinet, and from the cabinet to this deeper space. He approached it slowly, his steps measured, his mind no longer racing with questions but settling into a steady rhythm of observation and understanding, because whatever answers lay ahead, they were not meant to overwhelm, they were meant to be uncovered, one layer at a time. He knelt slightly, examining the compartment, noting the small latch set into its surface, and for a brief moment, he glanced back at Ranger, who remained still. His presence calm, his eyes steady, as if reminding Ethan of something simple but important, that he had not come here by accident, and he was not alone in this. Ethan reached out, his fingers closing around the latch, and as he prepared to open it, he felt the quiet weight of everything that had led him here settle into a single, clear thought, not spoken aloud, but understood without question. Some doors are not hidden to keep people out. They are hidden to make sure only the right person finds the courage to open them. The latch was colder than Ethan expected, not just from the air in the chamber but from the sense that it had not been touched in a very long time, and as his fingers curled around it, he felt a quiet stillness settle over the room, the kind that does not demand attention but holds it firmly, as if everything that had led to this moment was now waiting to see what he would do next. He pulled gently at first, testing it, and when it gave with a soft, controlled release, the compartment door opened inward, revealing a shallow space lined with dark metal, its interior far more deliberate than its modest size suggested. Inside, there was no clutter, no random collection of objects. Only a single envelope, thick and carefully sealed, resting at the center. As if it had been placed there with intention and left untouched ever since. Ethan did not reach for it immediately, his gaze lingering for a moment as he absorbed the simplicity of it, because after everything he had uncovered so far, the quiet presence of a single item carried more weight than any crowded shelf could have. Ranger shifted slightly beside him, his posture calm, his attention steady, and Ethan took that as enough. Enough to move forward, enough to trust that whatever waited. Inside that envelope was not something meant to overwhelm, but something meant to be understood. He lifted it slowly, feeling the firmness of the contents within, and turned it over in his hands, noticing the same familiar handwriting across the front, clear and deliberate, his own name written there as if it had always belonged in this place. Ethan Walker. The sight of it sent a subtle ripple through him, not of shock, but of recognition, the kind that does not need explanation because it feels true the moment it is seen. He broke the seal carefully, the paper giving way with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have in the stillness, and withdrew the contents, a folded document, heavier than ordinary paper, accompanied by a smaller note tucked inside. He opened the note first, his eyes moving across the lines with a growing sense that he was not just reading words, but stepping into something that had already been set in motion long before he arrived. If you are holding this, then you have already seen enough to know this place was never about what it looks like on the surface. The message began, the tone steady, measured, carrying the same quiet confidence as everything else he had found. This was built to protect something that could not survive in the open, not because it was fragile, but because it required the right kind of hands to carry it forward. Ethan's grip tightened slightly on the paper as he continued, the words drawing him deeper into their meaning with each line. The land above, the structure you were given, and everything beneath it belongs to a trust that was never meant to be claimed through wealth or status, but through alignment, through the simple fact that you arrived here when you had nothing left to lose and still chose to keep moving. Ethan paused, his breath slowing as the weight of that sentence settled into him, because it did not feel like coincidence, it felt like confirmation. He unfolded the larger document, his eyes scanning the formal language, the legal structure that outlined ownership, not just of the shack, but of the land surrounding it, acres he had not yet explored, tied together under a designation that made his pulse shift slightly, a private trust, established decades ago, with a purpose that extended far beyond property. It detailed resources, accounts, and holdings connected to multiple locations, each one referenced in the maps he had seen, each one part of a network designed to remain unnoticed unless someone knew where to look. Ethan lowered the document slightly, the reality of it settling in not as sudden excitement, but as a quiet, steady realization that what he had been handed was not just something valuable, it was something purposeful. Ranger rose slowly to his feet, moving closer, his presence steady at Ethan's side, and for a moment, the two of them stood there in the silence of the chamber, surrounded by the evidence of something far larger than either of them alone. Ethan looked back at the note, his eyes catching the final line written there, simple, direct, and unmistakable. This was never about inheritance, it was about continuation, and now it is yours to decide what that means. The words did not feel like a burden, they felt like a choice, one that did not demand urgency but required understanding, and as Ethan folded the documents carefully, holding them with a sense of awareness that had not been there when he first stepped into the shack, he realized something that had not been clear before. He had not been left with nothing, he had been left with something that only looked like nothing until someone took the time to see it differently. He turned his gaze slowly across the chamber, the maps, the shelves, the quiet order of it all, and then toward the passage that would lead back up to the world above, a world that had not changed in the hours he had been below, but one that would feel very different when he stepped back into it. And as Ranger moved ahead, guiding the way without hesitation, Ethan followed, not as a man returning from a discovery, but as someone carrying forward something that had been waiting patiently, not for the strongest, not for the wealthiest, but for the one who had been broken just enough to recognize its true value. The climb back up felt different than the descent, not because the path had changed, but because Ethan had, and as he followed Ranger through the narrow passage, the beam of the flashlight moving steadily ahead, the walls that once felt like boundaries now felt like markers, quiet reminders of how far he had already come. The air shifted as they moved upward, growing slightly warmer, carrying with it the faint scent of wood and rain that had settled into the shack above, and when Ethan stepped back through the hidden panel into the dim interior, the world did not feel smaller again, it felt wider, as if the space beneath had expanded everything above it. The floorboards creaked softly under his weight, the same familiar sound from earlier, but now it no longer carried the hollow emptiness he had sensed before. Instead it felt grounded, connected to something deeper that ran beneath it. Ranger moved ahead, crossing the room with calm purpose before settling near the doorway, his body lowering onto the worn wood as if returning to a place that now belonged to him in a way it had not just hours ago. Ethan stood there for a moment, the folded documents still in his hand, the quiet of the shack wrapping around him, and for the first time since leaving the courthouse, the silence did not press against him, it held him. He walked slowly to the window, brushing aside the thin curtain that hung loosely from its rod, and looked out across the clearing, the rain now reduced to a soft drizzle that tapped gently against the roof and the ground below, the trees standing tall and still as if they had always known this place was more than it appeared. The land stretched farther than he had noticed before, the edge of the clearing giving way to a line of pines that marked the boundary of something larger, something that was no longer just an empty property on a piece of paper, but part of a network, a purpose, a continuation that had quietly waited for him to arrive. He unfolded the document once more, not to confirm what he had read, but to feel it again, the weight of it, the reality of it, the way his name sat there not as a coincidence, but as a conclusion reached through a path he had not known he was walking. He thought of the years behind him, the service, the loss, the long stretches of time when nothing seemed to move forward, and how all of it had led him here, not to a place of wealth in the way most people would understand it, but to something far more enduring, something that could not be measured in dollars or acres alone. Ranger let out a slow breath behind him, the soft sound carrying across the room, and Ethan turned, meeting the dog's steady gaze. The same gaze that had guided him to the loose floorboard, the hidden box, the passage below, and everything beyond it. "You knew, did you not?" he said quietly, not expecting an answer, but feeling one all the same in the calm presence beside him. He walked back to the center of the room, looking down at the spot where the floorboard had been lifted, now resting loosely in place, hiding what lay beneath just as it had before, and he understood then that the secret was not meant to disappear again, but it was not meant to be revealed carelessly either, it was meant to be carried forward, protected not by locks or walls, but by intention. He set the documents carefully on the table near the wall, not storing them away, but placing them where they could be reached, used, understood, and he moved to the door, opening it slowly as the cool air drifted in, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and pine, a reminder that the world outside was still there, unchanged in its appearance, yet different in its meaning. The sky had begun to clear, the clouds parting just enough to let a soft light settle over the clearing, and Ethan stepped out onto the worn wooden porch. The boards beneath him steady despite their age, the land stretching out before him in quiet openness. Ranger followed, stepping beside him, his posture relaxed, his attention no longer searching, but present, as if the task he had carried was complete and something new had taken its place. Ethan stood there, breathing in the cool air, feeling the weight of everything he had lost earlier that day shift into something else, something that did not erase the past, but reshaped it into a foundation rather than a collapse. He looked out across the land. Once more, his gaze steady, his thoughts clear, and in that moment, he understood that this place was not given to him as compensation, it was given to him as continuation, not a reward for what he had lost, but an invitation for what he could still build. The shack behind him, once dismissed as worthless, now stood as the entrance to something far greater, something that would not reveal itself all at once, but would unfold over time, step by step, just as it had begun to do. Ranger leaned slightly against his leg, a quiet, grounding presence, and Ethan rested his hand gently on the dog's back, his fingers pressing into the familiar warmth of his fur. He was not standing at the end of something anymore, he was standing at the beginning of something he had not known to look for, and as the light continued to break through the clouds above, casting a soft glow across the clearing, Ethan Walker realized that sometimes what looks like the smallest, most broken piece of a life is not what is left behind, it is what has been waiting all along for someone to see it differently.